Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. The story of Neville Longbottom is a true chronicle of transformation, from a timid, insecure boy into a hero who stood shoulder to shoulder with the greatest wizards of his time. From the awkward student who constantly forgot spells to the leader of the resistance against Snape and his allies, Neville's journey became a symbol that courage can hide in the most unexpected hearts. But within his fate lie many details often overlooked. Today, let's bring them together. Enjoy watching. Number 1. His admission to Hogwarts was not guaranteed. Neville's destiny could have turned out very differently. To enter Hogwarts, a child's name had to be written by the Quill of Acceptance into a special book. The Quill was willing to give a chance, but the book was strict and refused to inscribe those it deemed insufficiently magical. That was the case with Neville. The Quill tried to write him down, but the book rejected him. For a long time, it considered the boy not gifted enough. Only by chance, when his great-uncle threw him out of a window and he survived, did the book agree to record his name. His place at Hogwarts was decided on the very edge. Number 2. For many years he used his father's wand. Neville's failures in spellwork were long a subject of mockery, but the true reason lay in the fact that he was using his father's wand, and as we know, the wand chooses the wizard. Only after the events of Order of the Phoenix did he receive his own wand, and immediately began showing real results. It became clear to everyone that the problem had never been his talent, but the tool. Number 3. He may have been the last person to buy a wand from Ollivander. Neville's new wand appeared literally the day before Ollivander was kidnapped by Voldemort. His grandmother, impressed by her grandson's courage, bought it for him herself. "Yes, I thought Gran would be angry," Neville said. "But she was pleased instead. She said I was finally becoming like Dad. She bought me a new wand, cherry wood and unicorn hair. We think it was one of the last wands Ollivander sold. He disappeared the next day." Thus, Neville was likely the final customer of the great wand maker before his disappearance. Number 4. Neville's parents defied Voldemort 3 times. Few realized that Neville could have been the chosen one instead of Harry. Trelawney's prophecy fit him too, the boy born to those who have thrice defied Voldemort. This meant Frank and Alice Longbottom were not merely aurors, but among the bravest and most persistent fighters. Their fate was tragic, but their courage became an eternal part of magical history. Number 5. Neville asked to be sorted into Hufflepuff. Before entering Hogwarts, he was convinced he was not ready for the trials of Gryffindor. The reputation of that house frightened him, and he begged the Sorting Hat to send him to Hufflepuff. Yet the debate was long. The Hat insisted on its choice, though it usually respects the student's wishes. In the end, Neville became one of the rare children whose sorting lasted more than 5 minutes. And still, his place was in Gryffindor, something he proved by pulling out Godric's sword at the most critical moment. Number 6. Professor of Herbology. From the very beginning, Neville had one true passion: herbology. He cared for his plants, carried them around the castle, showed them off to his friends on the train, and dreamed of his own discoveries. His path was predictable yet honourable. After the war, he became the professor of herbology at Hogwarts. Moreover, he taught the children of Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny. The once timid boy became a mentor to a new generation. Number 7. Neville married Hannah Abbott. After the war, his life settled into peace. In J.K. Rowling's books, he married Hannah Abbott, a Hufflepuff student. She became the landlady of the Leaky Cauldron, and together they lived there in one of the rooms. The movie hinted at Neville's interest in Luna, but in the books fate chose another path. And it was a fitting end to his journey, from struggle to long-awaited peace. Number 8. His grandmother always saw a warrior in him. Augusta Longbottom never accepted weakness. From the moment Neville could walk, she compared him to his father, the Auror Frank Longbottom, who had stood against Voldemort and paid a terrible price. She pushed Neville to be brave, to be strong, to live up to the Longbottom name. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Neville confides, "My Gran's always telling me I'm not as good as my dad, but she was really proud when I fought at the Department of Mysteries." That pride, rare and fierce, meant more to him than any praise from teachers. Her strict love became the steel in his spine. When Death Eaters took over Hogwarts, Neville didn't run. He fought. He organized the students, endured punishment, and led the resistance. He later said, "She was shocked when she found out what I'd been doing. But then she said, 'I'm proud of you, Neville.'" The boy who once feared failing her had finally become the warrior she always believed he could be. Number 9, he feared Snape more than Voldemort. Neville, Longbottom's greatest fear was never Voldemort in his early years. It was Professor Snape. The dark dungeon of potions class became a place of humiliation where Snape mocked him for every mistake. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Neville admits this openly when Professor Lupin asks the class what frightens them most. While others named Dementors or Banshees, Neville whispered, "Professor Snape." For a boy already struggling with confidence, Snape's cruelty carved deep scars. The boggart lesson changed everything. When Lupin asked Neville to imagine something funny that would weaken the creature, Neville thought of his grandmother's wardrobe. With a wave of his wand, Snape's looming form transformed into a ridiculous figure in Augusta Longbottom's old dress, complete with a vulture-topped hat and handbag. The classroom erupted in laughter. For the first time, Neville stood tall, having turned his terror into triumph. That moment mattered more than it seemed. It was a seed of courage, showing Neville that fear could be faced, even mocked. Years later, he would stand against Death Eaters, against Voldemort himself. But it all began in that classroom. The boy who once trembled at a sneer found the strength to laugh at it. And in laughter, Neville found the first spark of the bravery that would define him. Number 10, he destroyed the last Horcrux of Voldemort. In the chaos of the Battle of Hogwarts, when curses lit the Great Hall and screams echoed through the castle, Neville Longbottom delivered the final blow that made Voldemort vulnerable. While Harry, Ron, and Hermione had spent months hunting down Horcruxes, it was Neville who destroyed the last one. From the flames of the Room of Requirement, from the terror of seeing friends fall, he found himself standing face to face with Nagini, Voldemort's monstrous serpent and living Horcrux. The Sorting Hat appeared in that desperate hour, called forth by Voldemort to mock the students. He forced it onto Neville's head, trying to humiliate him in front of everyone. But magic does not bend so easily. From inside the hat came the glint of silver, the sword of Godric Gryffindor, revealed only to those who truly embody courage. Neville grasped it, and in that moment the frightened boy he once was vanished. With a single swing, he beheaded Nagini, cutting through the final fragment of Voldemort's soul. The moment was not just brutal, but symbolic. Harry had once pulled the sword to kill the basilisk. Now, Neville did the same to end the reign of darkness. Without Nagini's death, Voldemort would have remained immortal, his soul hidden and protected. Harry could not have triumphed without that strike. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, it is written simply, "With a single stroke, Neville severed the great snake's head from its body." A sentence that carried the weight of destiny. For years, Neville had been underestimated, overlooked, even pitied. But when the world teetered on the edge of ruin, he stepped forward and acted. The last Horcrux fell not by the hand of the Chosen One, but by the hand of the boy no one had expected. That swing of the sword sealed Voldemort's fate, and in doing so it carved Neville's name forever into the legend of Hogwarts. Number 11. He had his own room of resistance. When Hogwarts fell under the control of Death Eaters and the shadow of Severus Snape, it was Neville Longbottom who refused to bend. With Harry gone, students looked for someone to guide them, and it was Neville who stepped forward. He took the Room of Requirement and turned it into more than just a magical space. It became a fortress, a sanctuary, and the beating heart of resistance inside the castle. The room shifted to protect its occupants, offering beds, food, and safety to those who opposed Voldemort's followers. Students like Luna Lovegood and Ginny Weasley joined him, forming the core of a new Dumbledore's army. Even when captured and beaten, Neville always came back, carrying bruises as proof of his defiance. As he once told Harry in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, "They've used the Cruciatus curse on me and on Seamus, but we're still here. We've kept it going." The room became a legend among the younger students. It was a place where whispers of hope survived, where children huddled together and believed Voldemort's rule could end. Death Eaters roamed the corridors, but they could never break through the room's walls. Inside, Neville's voice carried weight. He was no longer the boy people pitied, but the leader who inspired others to stand. In those days, Neville's courage was not just about duels or battles. It was about keeping alive the idea that Hogwarts still belonged to its students, not to darkness. The Room of Requirement, once used for secret lessons and pranks, became a citadel of rebellion, and at its centre stood Neville, the quiet boy who had grown into a symbol of defiance. Number 12. Neville as a true Gryffindor and a symbol of perseverance. Neville Longbottom never had the brilliance of Hermione, the fame of Harry, or even the natural ease of Ron. He was the boy who lost his toad on the train and stumbled in potions class. Yet every page of his story shows that courage is not about talent. It is about standing up when standing up seems impossible. From the very first book, when he blocked Harry, Ron, and Hermione at the common room door, Dumbledore reminded the whole school, "It takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies, but just as much to stand up to our friends." Through the years, Neville kept proving that lesson. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, he fought beside the others in the Department of Mysteries, battered and bloodied but never giving up. His spells faltered, his wand shook, yet he refused to run. That moment when Harry saw him stagger to his feet again and again made clear that Neville's strength came from something deeper than skill. It came from his heart. By the time of the Battle of Hogwarts, Neville had become the leader of Dumbledore's army in Harry's absence. He turned the Room of Requirement into a fortress, a refuge where younger students could resist Death Eaters. His voice, once timid, carried authority. Even Professor McGonagall trusted him. In those dark days, he embodied the spirit of Gryffindor more than anyone else. And then came the sword. When Voldemort's Snake Nagini struck terror into the battlefield, it was Neville who drew the sword of Gryffindor from the Sorting Hat and cut her down. The timid boy was gone. The hero had arrived. He showed the truth of Gryffindor. Bravery is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Neville proved that the smallest, most overlooked student could rise as the purest symbol of courage. Number 13, his first act of magic was unusual. Neville Longbottom's first burst of magic was unlike anyone else's. While Harry once made glass vanish at the zoo and Hermione famously set books on fire before even arriving at Hogwarts, Neville's story was far more dramatic. His family worried he might be a squib, someone born without magic, and his great-uncle Algy decided to put that fear to the test. One day, in front of the family, he held young Neville out of a window and simply let go. Everyone gasped, but instead of crashing to the ground, Neville floated gently down and bounced like a ball on the lawn, unharmed. This strange moment defined him. His grandmother, Augusta Longbottom, had always compared him to his father, the brave Auror, Frank Longbottom. She wanted proof that her grandson carried the same blood and power. Algy's reckless test gave her that proof. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Neville recalls the story himself. Great-uncle Algy kept trying to catch me off my guard, and once he nearly drowned me, but nothing worked until he pushed me off Blackpool Pier. The family's relief was enormous. They finally knew Neville belonged in the wizarding world. The incident was frightening, but it also carried a strange poetry. Neville's magic surfaced only when he was forced into danger, when the odds seemed hopeless. This would become the pattern of his life. Again and again, he found strength at the breaking point. From standing up to his friends in the common room to drawing the sword of Gryffindor in the Battle of Hogwarts, his courage always appeared in moments of desperation. The fall from the window was the first of many times when Neville refused to break. Looking back, it is easy to see why this story stayed in the family's memory. It was more than a magical accident. It was a sign. The boy everyone doubted would one day rise over and over again when pushed to the edge. His first act of magic was not subtle, not ordinary, and certainly not safe. It was dramatic, risky, and unforgettable, just like the path his life would take. Number 14, his Patronus remains unknown. Unlike Harry, who produced a stag, or Hermione, whose otter Patronus danced across the water, Neville's Patronus remains a mystery. J.K. Rowling never revealed what form it would have taken, leaving fans to wonder endlessly. In a world where the Patronus is a reflection of the soul, this silence feels intentional. It suggests that Neville's inner strength is something left for readers to imagine, rather than to be fixed in stone. Many fans point to his deep love of herbology and his odd little plant, the Mimbulus Mimbletonia, as a clue. Could his Patronus have been a creature tied to growth and resilience, like a badger, the emblem of Hufflepuff, or even something symbolic of his plants? Neville carried the Mimbulus proudly on the Hogwarts Express, showing it to Harry, Ron, Ginny, and Luna, even when they looked at it with confusion. That moment captures Neville perfectly. Strange, underestimated, but quietly powerful. Others argue his Patronus must mirror his courage in the Battle of Hogwarts. When he drew the sword of Gryffindor from the Sorting Hat and cut down Nagini, he proved his heart was as brave as any lion. It takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies, but just as much to stand up to our friends, Dumbledore once said of him in Philosopher's Stone. What animal could better embody that moment than a lion itself, the same symbol that had defined his house from the start? And yet there is something haunting about not knowing. Neville's Patronus, left unspoken, feels like a secret piece of his character, the part that belongs only to him. Unlike Harry's clear image of his father in the stag, or Ron's humour reflected in the Jack Russell Terrier, Neville is left to the imagination of every reader. Perhaps that is why his story inspires so much. He is both defined and undefined, a hero who still keeps one last mystery to himself. Number 15, one of the best duelists in the Battle of Hogwarts. Under the crumbling stone walls of Hogwarts, when chaos turned the Great Hall into a battlefield, Neville Longbottom stepped into a destiny that few would have predicted for him. For years, classmates had thought of him as clumsy, forgetful, and a shadow to Harry Potter's brilliance. Yet on that final night, with fire, smoke, and curses flying in every direction, Neville's wand arm was steady, and his courage burned brighter than the torches lighting the castle's corridors. The boy who once stumbled over spells became a duelist whose very presence on the battlefield reminded everyone that bravery could outweigh years of doubt. What makes Neville's transformation so extraordinary is not merely that he fought bravely, but that he did so against the most dangerous foes the wizarding world had ever known. Death Eaters, such as Antonin Dolohov, infamous for killing Gideon Prewett, were on the battlefield. Dolohov's reputation as a ruthless duelist was feared by even experienced aurors. And yet Neville, the student once mocked for failing simple charms, stood his ground. He was not simply surviving, he was countering spells, disarming, stunning, and pressing forward while others faltered. It was a turning point for both him and those who watched. He was no longer the frightened boy holding a toad, he was a warrior of Gryffindor. Rowling's words capture the defiance that marked Neville's stand. Then there was a yell and a great crash as a gigantic figure smashed one of the castle's windows and entered, and Neville was at the front, still fighting, still breathing, still defying. This passage is not just a detail in the storm of the final battle, but a declaration. It shows that Neville's strength was not hidden talent finally unleashed, but a steady build of resilience, sharpened through years of humiliation and quiet persistence. In the end, it was not about perfection of spellcraft, but the raw refusal to surrender. One of Neville's most impressive dueling moments came when he directly faced off against some of Voldemort's followers who vastly outclassed him in years of training. A telling scene shows him fighting against Fenrir Greyback, the savage werewolf allied with the Death Eaters. Greyback was infamous for his brutality, but Neville did not retreat. He engaged him directly, standing between the beast and the wounded, holding him back with spells fierce enough to keep him away until reinforcements came. It was not finesse alone that saved him. It was the courage to place himself in the line of danger with unwavering focus. The irony of Neville's role is that he embodied the prophecy that could have been his fate. Sybil Trelawney's prophecy spoke of a child born as the seventh month dies, who could defeat Voldemort. Harry Potter fit that role, but so did Neville. Voldemort's choice to mark Harry shaped the course of the war, but the prophecy's shadow never left Neville. In the Battle of Hogwarts, it seemed as though fate had been waiting for him to prove that, even without being the chosen one, he was chosen by destiny to stand unbroken. His dueling that night was more than skill. It was the manifestation of prophecy fulfilled in another form. In considering Neville's growth, one must remember how often he had been underestimated. Professor Snape sneered at his potions. His boggart took the form of Snape himself, the embodiment of fear. His own grandmother doubted his abilities, constantly comparing him unfavourably to his parents, the Aurors tortured into madness by Bellatrix Lestrange. Yet, when the war came to its climax, Neville did what even Snape himself could not in that moment. He fought openly against Voldemort's army with no shield of duplicity. He cast aside the weight of doubt and made his wand a weapon of unflinching loyalty. Dueling is not only about spell knowledge, but also about instinct, reaction, and sheer will. Neville had honed these skills during the years of resistance at Hogwarts when he led Dumbledore's army in Harry's absence. It was under his leadership that students learned to fight back against the Carrows, casting protective charms and practicing offensive spells. By the time the Battle of Hogwarts erupted, Neville had already fought countless small battles in the shadowed corridors of the castle. Each rebellion, each act of defiance, sharpened his instincts. When curses filled the air, his wand moved with the confidence of a leader who had been preparing for this day all along. One of the most striking aspects of Neville's role in the battle is his duel with Bellatrix Lestrange. Bellatrix, who had driven his parents insane with the Cruciatus Curse, stood before him as both enemy and personal nightmare. Though he did not ultimately strike her down, that was Molly Weasley's triumph, Neville engaged her in the fray with a fearlessness that only years of buried grief could ignite. To face the very witch who destroyed his family, not with hesitation, but with direct resistance, was an act of dueling as profound as any victory. In those moments, he was not only avenging his parents, but showing that he would never bow to fear. The duel that defines Neville above all, however, is not one fought wand to wand, but blade to curse. When Voldemort summoned him forward and offered him a place in his new order, Neville refused. The Dark Lord set the sorting hat on his head and conjured fire to consume him. Yet, from that trap, Neville drew forth the sword of Gryffindor. In one swing, he decapitated Nagini, Voldemort's final Horcrux. It was not a spell, but a duel of willpower, of courage against darkness, and Neville's strike turned the tide of the war. As Rowling wrote, with a single stroke, Neville sliced the snake's head clean off. This was the finishing blow that made Voldemort mortal again. Number 16, Neville and Harry as prophecy twins. Of all the characters in the Harry Potter saga, few undergo such a striking transformation as Neville Longbottom. At first, he is portrayed as clumsy, shy, and constantly overlooked, a boy who can barely keep track of his toad Trevor and who forgets the simplest spells. Yet behind this timid exterior lies a story of profound weight, one bound by threads of prophecy and destiny that could have changed the entire course of the wizarding world. What many readers overlook is that Neville, in his own way, was as closely tied to the fate of Voldemort as Harry himself. The prophecy delivered by Sybil Trelawney spoke of a child born as the 7th month dies, a child who would have the power the Dark Lord knows not. Both Harry Potter and Neville Longbottom fit the description, yet Voldemort's choice fell upon Harry. This single decision determined which boy would carry the scar, the fame, and the burden of the chosen one. Had Voldemort turned his attention to Neville, the timid Gryffindor might have grown under the same shadow, shaped into a different kind of warrior by the same cruelty and expectation. Neville's life mirrored Harry's in many haunting ways. Harry's parents, James and Lily Potter, were murdered in Godric's Hollow, while Neville's parents, Frank and Alice Longbottom, suffered a different fate. Tortured into madness by Bellatrix Lestrange and other Death Eaters, Frank and Alice lived, but they were shadows of themselves, confined to St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries. Neville visited them, but they never recognized him as their son, and as Dumbledore once explained, in many ways it is a worse fate than death. Thus both boys grew up without the parents who should have guided them, raised instead by guardians who could not fill the void. Harry lived with the Dursleys, despised and neglected, while Neville grew up under the stern and often critical eye of his grandmother Augusta. Each child carried wounds invisible to most, marks left not on their skin but on their spirits. It is easy to see why the wizarding world underestimated Neville. His classmates laughed when his spells failed, Professor Snape mocked him relentlessly, and even within Gryffindor he seemed more like a liability than a leader. Yet in this, too, Neville reflected Harry. Harry was constantly doubted by the adults in his life, labelled a liar in his 5th year, whispered about as unstable, even accused of being dangerous. Both boys bore the weight of others' low expectations. What sets them apart is how each used these doubts to forge resilience. For Harry, resilience came in defiance, in stubborn determination to prove himself. For Neville, it emerged quietly, like roots beneath the soil, slowly growing stronger until they could no longer be ignored. One of the most striking parallels between them lies in their relationship with fear and courage. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Neville's moment of bravery comes not against a dark wizard, but against his own friends. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione try to sneak out at night, Neville confronts them, stammering but resolute. "You can't go out, you'll be caught again, Gryffindor will be in trouble." Though small in scale compared to Harry's duel with Voldemort, Dumbledore acknowledges Neville's courage, awarding him points for standing up even when it was hardest. This scene foreshadows the kind of man Neville would become, one who chooses to fight not because he is fearless, but because he knows the cost of silence. The prophecy tied Neville and Harry together like twins in destiny, and Voldemort's choice created a strange duality. By attempting to kill Harry, Voldemort inadvertently marked him as his equal, ensuring that their fates were intertwined. But consider the alternative. If Voldemort had chosen Neville, the Dark Lord's obsession might have marked him instead. Would Neville have developed the same grit under constant pursuit, the same instinct to rebel against injustice, the same leadership qualities that Harry displayed? The narrative tempts us to imagine this possibility, and in doing so, it suggests that Neville carried within him a potential for greatness that was never merely theoretical. Throughout the series, Neville's progress unfolds in quiet but undeniable steps. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, he joins Dumbledore's army, motivated not only by loyalty, but by the personal wound left by his parents suffering at the hands of Death Eaters. In the climactic battle at the Department of Mysteries, Neville is there beside Harry, wand shaking, nose broken, yet refusing to abandon his friends. He fights even though he can barely hold his wand properly, showing the kind of courage that belongs not to prodigies, but to ordinary people who refuse to bow. "Dumbledore's army!" he shouts defiantly when cornered, a phrase that reveals both his loyalty and his refusal to be erased from the fight. That moment echoes Harry's own stubborn resilience, another sign of their mirrored destinies. It is crucial to recognize how environment shaped both boys. Harry's childhood was defined by neglect and cruelty, but in that bleakness he discovered strength. Neville's life under his grandmother's stern discipline created a similar dynamic. Augusta Longbottom often compared him unfavorably to his parents, demanding that he live up to their legacy. For a child, such expectations can be crushing, but they also instilled in Neville a desire to prove himself. His story is one of a slow-burning fire, a determination that grows under pressure until it becomes uncontainable. In this sense, both Harry and Neville were forged by adversity, each becoming stronger than anyone had predicted. Number 17. The symbolic meaning of his name. Of all the characters who walk the stone corridors of Hogwarts, Neville Longbottom may be one of the most underestimated, and yet his story carries an almost hidden layer of symbolism that begins with his very name. At first glance, Neville Longbottom sounded clumsy, almost designed for ridicule. Students like Draco Malfoy did not hesitate to make Neville the butt of their jokes, and even some Gryffindors quietly rolled their eyes at his awkwardness. But behind the amusing sound lies a deeper meaning. The first name, Neville, comes from Old French and means new town or new beginning. The surname, Longbottom, can be read as long bottom, suggesting the idea of being at the lowest point for a long time. Taken together, the name itself was almost prophetic. The boy who started from the very bottom would eventually rise to embody renewal, strength, and perseverance. Neville's journey was never about brilliance or effortless success. Unlike Harry, who bore a scar of destiny, or Hermione, who wielded knowledge like a weapon, Neville began as a boy who could barely keep up in class. He famously melted cauldrons in potions, tripped over his own feet during flying lessons, and once ended up hanging off the Hogwarts chandelier after a broom betrayed him. His name reflected this lowly start, as if destiny had conspired to remind him daily that he lived at the bottom. Yet even in the lowest of places, the seed of something extraordinary was already waiting. Neville nearly broke down crying at the thought of another year like this, writes J.K., rolling in the Philosopher's Stone, painting him as fragile. But the hidden symbolism of new beginning lingered. Like a seed buried deep in the soil, Neville's future was concealed within the earth of his own failures. It is worth noting that Neville was never truly talentless, even though his classmates often saw him that way. Professor Sprout, the head of Hufflepuff and teacher of herbology, repeatedly praised his gift with plants. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, when other students struggled with repotting mandrakes or identifying dangerous herbs, Neville excelled. Professor Sprout had a soft spot for Neville, rolling notes, and this was not mere pity. His ability to nurture living things symbolized the quiet resilience embedded in his name. Anew. Beginning often springs from the ground up, and Neville's surname seemed to tether him to the soil. Just as plants grow from the bottom of the earth, Neville's rise began in obscurity but reached upward toward the light. There is also a compelling irony in Neville's connection to prophecy. Readers often forget that Neville, not Harry, could have been the chosen one. Both boys were born in July, both had parents who defied Voldemort 3 times, and both were marked by fate. Dumbledore himself explained to Harry in the Order of the Phoenix, "Either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives." Neville could have been the child described in Trelawney's prophecy, but Voldemort's choice of Harry sealed their paths. Still, this overlooked possibility reinforces the symbolism of Neville's new beginning. While Harry carried the burden of the Chosen One, Neville was given a different destiny, to prove that heroism can rise even from the bottom. The surname Longbottom also resonates with stubborn persistence. To stay long at the bottom requires endurance, but it also suggests the eventual climb. Neville's persistence shone in small ways early on. In the Philosopher's Stone, he stood up to his own friends, blocking Harry, Ron, and Hermione from leaving the Gryffindor common room. "You can't go out, you'll get Gryffindor into trouble again," he cried, trembling but firm. Though easily dismissed, that act of bravery earned him the crucial points that secured Gryffindor the House Cup. Dumbledore's words still echo. It takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies, but just as much to stand up to our friends. Neville's name reflected this. Someone at the bottom, trembling yet standing tall. The Newtown aspect of Neville's name also finds resonance in his family history. His parents, Alice and Frank Longbottom, were tortured into madness by Bellatrix Lestrange and her fellow Death Eaters. Neville grew up in the shadow of their tragedy, raised by his formidable grandmother, Augusta Longbottom. For many years he bore the weight of comparison to their bravery and strength. Augusta often scolded him for being timid, as if ashamed that the boy who bore the Longbottom name was not yet a reflection of the family's legacy. But precisely here lies the renewal hidden in his first name. Neville represented a new chapter, not a repetition. His path was not to mimic his parents' heroism, but to discover his own way of embodying it. The culmination of this symbolic journey came in the Deathly Hallows, when Voldemort declared Harry dead and paraded him before the students of Hogwarts. Despair spread like wildfire. Yet Neville, the boy who once stumbled through spells, stepped forward. "I'll join you when hell freezes over," he shouted defiantly at Voldemort. That moment was a transformation. The boy from the bottom had risen to lead. He drew the Sword of Gryffindor from the Sorting Hat, a weapon that only the truly brave could summon, and struck down Nagini, Voldemort's final Horcrux. In one stroke, Neville completed the prophecy in his own way, delivering the decisive blow that allowed Harry to triumph. His name had indeed foretold it. From the bottom to the new dawn, number 18, he almost had a bigger storyline in the movies. Of all the characters in J.K. Rowling's saga, Neville Longbottom remains one of the most underestimated in the cinematic version, even though the books position him as a mirror to Harry himself. His story, though never as highlighted on screen, carries the weight of prophecy, courage, and the slow bloom of inner strength. In the books, Rowling carefully crafts Neville as a parallel thread, one that could have, under different circumstances, changed the very core of the story. Yet the films, with their inevitable trims and choices, left behind layers of his journey, showing only fragments of what was intended to be an intricate evolution. The prophecy that hangs over Harry is perhaps the most striking piece of evidence. When Dumbledore reveals it in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, he emphasizes that it could have applied to either Harry or Neville. Rowling herself explained that Voldemort chose Harry not because of destiny alone, but because of his own interpretation, marking Harry as his equal. But Neville, born at the same time, to parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times, stood as the unchosen one. This duality is crucial, and Rowling reinforces it throughout the narrative, creating deliberate echoes between the two boys' paths. Films only briefly nod to this, yet in the books the tension is ever present. The boy who could have been the chosen one ends up proving he was chosen for another kind of greatness. Neville's growth is also vividly portrayed through his clumsiness and lack of confidence in the early years. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Rowling describes him as the boy who kept losing his toad. He is mocked for his forgetfulness, his poor wand skills, and his lack of athleticism, but beneath that exterior lay a core of determination. When he stands up to Harry, Ron and Hermione in the common room, Dumbledore later praises him, saying, "It takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies, but just as much to stand up to our friends." That moment sets Neville on a course that the films too often reduced to comic relief. Yet Rowling planted the seeds early, and every book nurtured them. By The Prisoner of Azkaban and The Goblet of Fire, Neville's struggles with his magical ability grow clearer. His toad Trevor continues to escape, his spells misfire, and Professor Snape humiliates him in class. The memory of his parents, tortured into insanity by Bellatrix Lestrange and her fellow Death Eaters, looms over him, though readers only discover this truth in The Order of the Phoenix. In that haunting visit to St. Mungo's Hospital, Harry witnesses Neville's pain firsthand as his grandmother explains the tragedy. Neville's quiet dignity in that scene is heartbreaking. He slips his mother's discarded gum wrappers into his pocket as though they were priceless treasures. The films omit this scene entirely, denying audiences one of the most profound insights into Neville's resilience and inner sorrow. Rowling also gave Neville a strong connection to herbology, a detail that was nearly erased in the cinematic adaptations. In The Order of the Phoenix, he proudly shows Harry and Luna his rare plant, the Mimbolus Mimbletonia. This strange cactus-like specimen could squirt stinksap, and while the moment served as comic relief, it was also an important piece of Neville's personality. It revealed that he was not talentless but gifted in his own area, where confidence replaced insecurity. This was never shown on screen, and it is one of the many subtle losses that weakened his arc. Without these touches, viewers might never realize that Neville found solace and identity in the world of plants, making him more than a timid boy fumbling with spells. The turning point for Neville comes during Dumbledore's army in The Order of the Phoenix. Under Harry's guidance, he discovers his own capacity for bravery and magic. Rowling describes him practicing tirelessly, more determined than almost anyone else in the group. By the time they confront Death Eaters at the Department of Mysteries, Neville stands his ground despite being injured. His wand breaks, yet he fights on, proving the depth of his resolve. In the film, this sequence exists, but it minimizes his contribution, giving the impression that he was present but not pivotal. In truth, his willingness to keep battling despite pain and fear is one of the clearest signals of his transformation. As the books progress, Neville becomes a leader in his own right. In The Half-Blood Prince, his role is smaller but still present, showing his continued loyalty to Dumbledore's army. By the Deathly Hallows, when Harry, Ron and Hermione are away, Neville becomes the central figure of resistance within Hogwarts. He organizes rebellions against the Carrows, leads secret meetings in the Room of Requirement, and keeps the spirit of defiance alive. Rowling paints him as the unexpected commander of student courage, the one who endures beatings and punishment without giving up. These chapters elevate him to something greater than the timid boy introduced at the beginning. In the films, though, this resistance is acknowledged. It lacks the depth of leadership that the books highlight. The culmination of Neville's arc arrives in the Battle of Hogwarts. Rowling does not treat his role as secondary. Instead, she places him at the heart of the climax. When Voldemort summons him before the crowd, offering him a place at his side, Neville refuses with unshakable resolve. His declaration, "I'll join you when hell freezes over, Dumbledore's army," resonates as the voice of every student who refused to bow. And when he draws the sword of Gryffindor from the sorting hat, decapitating Nagini, he delivers the final blow that ensures Voldemort's defeat. The films preserve this moment, but it arrives with far less build-up than in the books. Viewers see a courageous act, but readers see the inevitable flowering of a destiny cultivated through years of struggle, loss, and persistence. Rowling herself noted the symmetry between Harry and Neville. Both were born to parents who defied Voldemort, both carried scars of loss, and both had the potential to fulfill the prophecy. Harry bore the mark of Voldemort's curse. Neville bore the burden of his parents' insanity. Harry's growth came through recognition of his role as leader and savior. Neville's came through the discovery that ordinary courage can be just as extraordinary. This balance is one of the most poignant aspects of the saga, yet the cinematic version flattens it, leaving Neville as a side character who emerges only at the end as a surprise hero. Matthew Lewis, who portrayed Neville, once remarked that his character's journey was one of the most satisfying to play, evolving from comic relief to warrior. His performance in the final film captured the bravery and defiance of the book's climax, but the earlier material never allowed him to explore the depth Rowling had written. Fans of the novels often lament that the screenwriters trimmed away the nuances, the hospital visit, the Mimbleless Mimbletonia, the countless small victories that built Neville's strength. Without them, his final act of heroism feels more abrupt than inevitable. The choice to downplay Neville's story was likely practical, as the films had to centre Harry. Yet it came at the cost of one of the saga's most inspiring parallel arcs. In many ways, Neville represents the ordinary person thrust into extraordinary times, who through persistence and bravery rises to meet destiny. While Harry is marked from birth as special, Neville demonstrates that greatness can come not from prophecy but from choice. This lesson is diminished in the films but shines brightly in the books. When Rowling wrote Neville drawing the sword of Gryffindor, she tied his story back to the beginning, when the Sorting Hat considered Harry for Slytherin and ultimately placed him in Gryffindor. The sword appears to true Gryffindors in times of need, and its arrival to Neville is proof that bravery, not birthright, defines worth. This symbolism enriches the final battle, reminding readers that the qualities Voldemort underestimated, loyalty, resilience, and quiet strength, were the very ones that led to his downfall. The films deliver the spectacle, but not the layered meaning behind it. Even though the adaptations left much behind, Neville's journey remains unforgettable for those who read the novels. His story is not one of sudden transformation, but of slow, painstaking growth, of a boy mocked for his failures who becomes the embodiment of resistance. He teaches that courage is not about being fearless, but about acting in spite of fear, that destiny is not only for the chosen, but for those who choose to fight. In Neville Longbottom, Rowling crafted not a side character, but a shadow hero, one whose light shines just as brightly as Harry's, even if the films never fully captured it. Number 19, his grandmother was prouder than anyone else. Of all the characters in the Harry Potter series, few experience such a remarkable transformation as Neville Longbottom. Readers first met him as a nervous, bumbling boy who often forgot passwords, misplaced possessions, and stumbled through lessons with a sense of clumsy unease. Yet behind this awkwardness was a quiet resilience, nurtured and in some ways repressed by his grandmother, Augusta Longbottom. Augusta was not the gentle, doting guardian one might expect for a child who had lost both parents to madness. Instead, she was stern, demanding, and relentless in her comparisons between Neville and his father, Frank Longbottom. Her presence loomed over Neville's childhood like an unforgiving shadow, but paradoxically it was also the source of the recognition that would finally allow him to bloom into the hero readers came to admire. Augusta's standards were harsh because she had known the bravery of her son and daughter-in-law. Frank and Alice Longbottom, both Aurors, had stood against Voldemort's followers in the First War and suffered unimaginable cruelty at the hands of Bellatrix Lestrange and her fellow Death Eaters. Their fate left Neville with the weight of expectation and legacy, one that he constantly felt unable to bear. Augusta reminded him of this at every turn, insisting that he measure up to the parents he barely remembered. The books often portray her as impatient with his failures, as when Neville explained his struggles, only to be met with remarks that he should have inherited more of Frank's strength. Neville's fear of not being good enough was magnified by her constant reminders, and it showed in his trembling attempts during classes, such as his fear of Professor Snape in potions, or his nervous stammering in transfiguration. Yet Augusta's severity was not rooted in cruelty. She had endured the loss of her only son and daughter-in-law to a fate worse than death. The anguish of visiting St. Mungo's and seeing Alice handing Neville a chewing gum wrapper, not recognizing her own child, hardened Augusta. She was determined that her grandson would not grow up weak, not in a world where darkness could return at any moment. That pressure could have broken Neville completely, but instead it planted the seeds of resilience that slowly began to sprout in his Hogwarts years. Though he faltered often, he never stopped trying. Each failure became another scar that he carried with quiet persistence, waiting for the moment when perseverance would finally triumph. That triumph began to reveal itself during the events of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. For the first time, Neville found himself surrounded by peers willing to fight alongside him rather than laugh at his clumsiness. Under Harry's leadership in Dumbledore's army, he discovered that he was capable of more than he had believed. Training in the Room of Requirement gave him a place to practice without humiliation, and slowly his wand work improved. Rowling emphasizes this growth when Harry notes Neville's determination. Neville's pluck had increased quite astonishingly as the term went on. Order of the Phoenix, Chapter 18. No longer the boy who shrank at every reprimand, he was beginning to resemble the Auror's son that Augusta had always demanded him to be. The battle in the Department of Mysteries marked the turning point not only for Neville, but also for his grandmother's perception of him. Despite suffering a broken nose and being gravely injured, Neville refused to back down. When Death Eaters tried to silence him, he persisted, continuing to shout warnings and to fight with ferocious bravery. Harry himself observed Neville's determination when, in spite of his injuries, he still attempted to protect his friends. This was not the timid boy who had once been humiliated by Malfoy in the common room. This was a Longbottom who was willing to risk everything for the cause of resistance. The courage that night left an indelible mark on Augusta, even if she was not present to witness it firsthand. Reports of his valor reached her, and the boy she once criticized had proven himself in the most dangerous of battles. What followed was one of the most symbolic gestures in Neville's story. Augusta purchased for him his first new wand. Until then, Neville had been using his father's wand, a relic of Frank Longbottom's Auror days. While it symbolized legacy and expectation, it also carried with it the weight of comparison and the constant reminder of who Neville was supposed to be. After the battle at the Ministry, the wand was broken, and Augusta did not hesitate to provide her grandson with a new one from Ollivander's. It was more than a gift, it was a recognition that Neville was now forging his own path, no longer living solely in the shadow of his parents. The gesture represented Augusta's acceptance that Neville was growing into the wizard he was meant to be, not just a copy of Frank. This shift in Augusta's attitude culminated in her most famous remark, spoken after witnessing Neville's bravery. She told him that he was starting to live up to his father at last. To Neville this was not another rebuke, but an acknowledgement, perhaps the first genuine one he had ever received from her. That simple sentence carried immense power. For a boy who had lived his life believing himself to be inadequate, Augusta's pride was transformative. It was the validation he had been yearning for, the proof that he was not a disappointment but a worthy heir to the Longbottom name. That acknowledgement lit a fire in Neville, a confidence that would blaze in the battles yet to come. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. Neville's newfound confidence manifested vividly in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, and even more so in Deathly Hallows. He was no longer afraid to speak out, no longer the timid boy who once lost points for Gryffindor because he dared to stand up to Harry, Ron and Hermione in their first year. Instead, he became the de facto leader of Dumbledore's army when Harry was away. In Deathly Hallows, it was Neville who kept hope alive within the walls of Hogwarts, organizing resistance. Against the Carrows and refusing to submit to Voldemort's regime, his courage in those final years owed as much to his own perseverance as to the moment his grandmother finally acknowledged his worth. The parallel between Neville and Harry is striking. Both boys were born under the same prophecy, either of whom could have been chosen as Voldemort's target. Both lost their parents in different ways, and both carried the burden of expectation. The difference lay in how they were raised. Harry under neglect and abuse, Neville under stern expectation and comparison. In the end, however, both paths forged warriors. Augusta's pride in Neville not only validated him, but also fulfilled part of that prophecy in spirit. She had helped raise not just a boy, but a defender who would stand against the darkest wizard of all time. Readers often overlook Augusta's role, focusing instead on her criticisms and severity. Yet her transformation is crucial. By recognizing Neville's bravery and providing him with his own wand, she gave him the independence and confidence he needed. It is easy to imagine the pride she must have felt during the Battle of Hogwarts, when Neville beheaded Nagini with the sword of Gryffindor, striking the final blow that ensured Voldemort's downfall. Though Augusta's remark came years earlier, its resonance echoed in that moment, for Neville had indeed become the hero she had always hoped her grandson could be. The moment also highlights Rowling's recurring theme of recognition and validation. So many characters in the series grow stronger when they are finally seen for who they are. Harry, when Dumbledore acknowledges his unique resilience, Ron when his friends depend on his strategic insight, and Neville when Augusta admits her pride. In Neville's case, the impact is profound because the validation came from the very person whose opinion had shaped his entire childhood. It was not the admiration of teachers or peers that transformed him, but the long-awaited pride of the one family member he most feared disappointing. A specific example of Neville's transformation can be seen in his confrontation with Voldemort in Deathly Hallows. Even when offered the chance to join the Death Eaters, Neville refused and drew the sword of Gryffindor from the Sorting Hat. This act of defiance, witnessed by the entire school, marked his complete evolution from timid boy to fearless warrior. One cannot help but recall Augusta's words as he stood defiantly before Voldemort. He was indeed living up to Frank's legacy, and perhaps even surpassing it. For readers, the memory of that earlier moment makes his final triumph all the more powerful. It is also telling that Neville's strength came not from seeking revenge for his parents, but from defending others. His bravery was rooted not in hatred, but in loyalty, compassion, and resilience. These qualities had always been there, hidden under his insecurities, waiting for acknowledgement to bring them to light. Augusta's pride was the spark that revealed them, the catalyst that turned potential into reality. Without that moment, Neville's journey might have unfolded differently, and the outcome of the final battle could have been altered. In this light, Augusta Longbottom's strictness takes on a new meaning. She may have been stern and unyielding, but she was also preparing Neville for the harsh world he would face. Her pride was not easily earned, but once given, it carried immeasurable weight. Neville's acceptance of her words marked the end of his self-doubt and the beginning of his true legacy as one of Hogwarts' greatest defenders. The timid boy who once feared losing house points had become the courageous man whose actions would be remembered alongside Harry, Ron, and Hermione. When readers revisit Neville's story, they often find themselves inspired not only by his courage, but also by the moment of recognition that changed him. It is a reminder that acknowledgement, even from a single person, can transform a life. Augusta Longbottom may have been stern, but in the end, she was also the proud grandmother who helped shape a hero. For Neville, her words were more powerful than any spell, and their echo resounded in every act of bravery that followed. Number 20, his favourite place at Hogwarts, was the greenhouse. Of course. Here's a 1,300-word narrative article, 15 long paragraphs, in the style of a Harry Potter magazine, about Neville Longbottom's hidden love for the greenhouses of Hogwarts. Neville. Longbottom's journey through the halls of Hogwarts is often remembered for his bravery, especially in the final battle against Voldemort, when he drew the sword of Gryffindor and destroyed the last Horcrux. Yet long before he stood in front of the Dark Lord, Neville had a sanctuary that many overlooked. While Harry Potter felt at home on the Quidditch pitch, Hermione Granger buried herself in the library, and Ron Weasley preferred the cosy familiarity of the Gryffindor common room. Neville found his peace among the sprawling glass walls of the Hogwarts greenhouses. The greenhouses were not as majestic as the Great Hall, nor as mysterious as the Room of Requirement, but, for Neville, they were something more. They were a home inside the castle where he could truly breathe. In those greenhouses, filled with the earthy smell of soil and the rustle of leaves, Neville discovered something he had struggled to find in the classrooms or the common room: confidence. Professor Sprout, the head of Hufflepuff, and the school's herbology professor noticed his quiet passion. When she guided students through lessons on mandrakes, gillyweed, or bubituba pus, Neville was not the clumsy boy who tripped over his robes or misplaced his wand. Instead, he was focused, sure-handed, and oddly graceful. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, when the mandrakes were first introduced, Neville's voice carried a rare note of authority as he reminded his classmates, "They've got a powerful restorative. You can use them to wake people who've been petrified." For once, the boy who so often struggled in potions or charms was the one offering knowledge. Neville's classmates rarely realized how much time he spent there, often returning to the greenhouses outside of class hours. He would wander between rows of shrivel figs, gently water the fanged geraniums, and carefully prune pufferpods until their luminous pink seeds scattered like fireworks in the air. The greenhouse was not simply a place for study, it was a place where Neville felt less judged. The plants demanded patience and care, but never mocked mistakes. Unlike spells that might backfire or potions that could explode, a plant grew steadily under the right hands, and Neville's hands, though often trembling in front of his peers, were steady when handling roots and soil. It is telling that when disaster struck Hogwarts, Neville's knowledge of herbology often became unexpectedly vital. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when Harry's secret group trained in the Room of Requirement, Neville's progress was slow, and yet he never stopped showing up. Outside those hidden walls, however, he found pride in herbology. During lessons, his face would light up as Professor Sprout introduced new, magical plants. When Death Eaters infiltrated the castle years later, it was Neville who led resistance fighters through the secret passages and filled the corridors with dangerous plants. He turned his greenhouse knowledge into a weapon. Venomous tentacular vines and Snargaluff pods became part of the defense of Hogwarts. That act was not random. It was born from years of quiet devotion to those glass-walled sanctuaries. The greenhouse also symbolized Neville's personal resilience. As a child, he had been underestimated by his family, even mocked by his formidable grandmother for not showing signs of magical ability until he was nearly 8 years old. The greenhouse was his way of proving, to himself, if not to others, that he was not lacking. He could nurture and protect life. In contrast to the violence of curses and hexes, the steady care of plants gave him a gentler strength. He did not need to be Harry Potter's double in courage. He could be Neville Longbottom, the boy who healed instead of destroyed. That quiet truth eventually made him one of the most essential figures of the Resistance. One particularly moving detail comes from Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when Neville gives Harry a small vial of gillyweed, which ultimately saves Harry's life during the Triwizard Tournament's second task. That moment was not accidental. The knowledge Neville gained in the greenhouse translated directly into a decisive act of friendship and loyalty. Though Dobby later admits he was the one who ultimately provided the gillyweed, the books make clear that Neville had suggested it first in the original manuscript plan. Rowling herself once hinted that herbology was to be Neville's path toward heroism, even if the final version of the story gave the moment to the house elf. Still, it is undeniable that Harry's survival in the water task was tied to knowledge Neville cherished, and that knowledge had its roots in the greenhouse. The atmosphere of the greenhouse also shaped Neville's personality. Surrounded by living things, he developed compassion that extended far beyond plants. His loyalty to his friends, his determination to protect the younger students when Hogwarts was under Death Eater control, and his ability to endure cruelty from the Carrows all echoed the patience of a gardener. A plant takes time to bloom, and Neville understood this truth better than anyone. Even when others dismissed him, he continued to grow in silence, waiting for the moment when his strength would be recognized. It is no surprise, then, that after the war, Neville did not choose the ministry or aura training. Though he had proven himself as a warrior, his true calling remained the greenhouse. He returned to Hogwarts not as a student but as a teacher, stepping into the role of professor of herbology. Under his guidance, the greenhouses became more than classrooms. They became places of inspiration. Generations of young witches and wizards found joy in the study of magical plants, just as Neville once had. His story became a testament that greatness does not only come from dueling skills or political power. Sometimes it grows quietly in the soil, tended by steady hands and a gentle heart. The plants themselves became woven into Neville's legacy. He often spoke to his students about mandrakes, reminding them how they had once saved lives during the Chamber of Secrets crisis. He demonstrated the resilience of the Mimbulus Mimbletonia, a plant he himself had once carried with pride, which sprayed stinksap when prodded, but symbolized growth despite awkwardness. For Neville, every plant told a story, just as every student carried hidden potential. The greenhouse became both a classroom and a mirror, a place where awkward seedlings grew into strong beings. One can imagine Neville walking among the rows, now an adult, remembering the boy he once was. He must have recalled the trembling hands that struggled to perform spells, the embarrassment of forgetting passwords, and the jeers of classmates like Draco Malfoy. And yet, inside those glass walls, he had found a different truth. He had learned that strength is not always loud or immediate. Like the roots beneath the soil, it grows unseen until the moment it is needed. The greenhouse was proof of that lesson. Quotes from the books highlight this transformation. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Neville once again shows his devotion when Professor Sprout mentions, "I expect you to all collect 10 inches of parchment on self-fertilizing shrubs." Neville, unlike most of his classmates, looks pleased at the assignment. That quiet smile of satisfaction captures who he was at heart. While others groaned over essays, Neville leaned forward, eager to write about the subject he loved most. In those little details, Rowling gave us glimpses of the boy who would one day embody the spirit of herbology itself. The symbolism of Neville's greenhouse resonates with the themes of the series. Harry's story is about courage in the face of darkness, Hermione's about wisdom and the pursuit of truth, and Ron's about loyalty and heart. Neville's story, however, is about growth. The greenhouse is the perfect metaphor, a place where fragile beginnings become resilient forms of life. It reminds readers that even those who start small, overlooked and doubted, can flourish into leaders and heroes. There is a profound beauty in imagining Neville's greenhouse after the war. Perhaps he planted roses in memory of his parents, who had been tortured into madness, but whose love never withered. Perhaps he kept a corner filled with venomous tentacula, a reminder of the dangers he once turned against invaders of his school. Perhaps he nurtured gentle pufferpods to scatter light across the room, a symbol of hope. In that space, Neville's life story unfolded not in battles, but in leaves, roots, and blossoms. Generations of students who studied under Professor Longbottom carried forward his passion. Some became healers using plants for medicinal purposes, others became researchers discovering new magical species, but all of them remembered their professor walking between rows of greenery, speaking with quiet enthusiasm about the life that flourished around them. They remembered that in the heart of the castle, amid the clash of history and the scars of war, there was still a place where growth and renewal triumphed. Neville Longbottom's favourite place in Hogwarts was not a tower, a hall, or a common room. It was a greenhouse. Within those walls of glass, he found his courage long before he drew a sword. He learned patience, resilience, and compassion. And in the end, he gave back to Hogwarts what it had once given to him. A sanctuary where life could bloom even in the shadow of darkness. Number 21. He had a talent for making friends in unexpected places. Neville Longbottom was never destined to stand at the centre of Harry Potter's story, yet his presence in the background shaped the rhythm of Hogwarts more than readers often realise. He was clumsy, forgetful, and constantly doubting himself, yet this same boy had an unexpected strength, his ability to find friends in the unlikeliest of corners. While Harry, Ron, and Hermione took the spotlight, Neville was quietly building bridges, gathering trust, and showing that even someone who seemed insignificant could become a rallying figure for others. This rare gift of his, the knack for uniting people, is what ultimately transformed him into one of the most essential figures of resistance in the wizarding world. Even in his earliest years, Neville's connections revealed his natural instinct for companionship. He wasn't part of the famous trio, but he lingered around them with quiet loyalty. He wasn't the bravest in his first year, yet he displayed courage when he tried to stop Harry, Ron, and Hermione from sneaking out, an act that earned him the respect of Dumbledore himself. It may have been small, but that moment showed a boy who valued loyalty to rules and friendships even when it risked his own humiliation. His bravery was clumsy, yes, but it was grounded in sincerity. This same sincerity would later be what drew others to him. When Sirius Black returned to the wizarding world, Neville did not shun him as some others did. Sirius had a notorious reputation, his name whispered with fear and suspicion, yet Neville, instead of recoiling, found an odd respect for the man. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Neville's trust in Sirius was unwavering when the group gathered at Grimmauld Place. While others saw danger and chaos in Sirius's restless energy, Neville recognized an ally and a mentor figure, someone who validated his place in their circle of resistance. Sirius, for his part, treated Neville with a quiet seriousness, never dismissing him as the clumsy boy, which was how so many others saw him. This mutual recognition formed a bond that readers often overlook. His friendship with Luna Lovegood was another testament to Neville's unusual gift. Most students laughed at Luna, branding her Loony Lovegood, because of her eccentric beliefs about creatures no one else had seen and her dreamy, far-off stares. But Neville did not laugh. Instead, he respected her quiet wisdom and found in her an unwavering friend. During Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Luna and Neville were among the few who stood loyally with Harry when others questioned him. It was a bond built not on popularity but on an unspoken understanding that both of them had been outsiders at Hogwarts. Luna offered him encouragement, and Neville, in turn, gave her validation. This was Neville's gift. Where others saw oddity, he saw value. By the time Dumbledore's army was formed, Neville had fully stepped into his role as a connector of people. Harry may have been the leader, but Neville was the steady presence that gave the group cohesion. In Order of the Phoenix, J.K. Rowling writes of Neville's determination. Neville had never been more determined, never been more serious. The boy who once struggled to remember the simplest spells began to excel when taught by Harry, encouraged by friends, and surrounded by the atmosphere of unity. His persistence inspired others, showing that even the least likely student could grow into someone formidable. It was not only about learning spells, it was about embodying the spirit of perseverance. This perseverance turned into leadership when the war reached its darkest point. In Deathly Hallows, when Hogwarts fell under the control of the Carrows and Snape, Neville became the true heart of resistance within the castle. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were on the run, but Neville was inside, keeping the flame alive. It is here that his ability to find friends in unexpected places blossomed to its fullest. He worked alongside Ginny Weasley, Luna Lovegood, and countless others, but he also rallied students who had previously remained silent. Even those from families known for supporting the ministry began to believe in Neville's vision. His honesty, his refusal to betray his principles, and his courage in standing up to cruelty made him a beacon in a place of darkness. The Room of Requirement, that magical space that changed to fit the needs of those who sought it, became Neville's fortress. It was more than just a hiding place, it was a sanctuary where trust grew. Under Neville's guidance, the room sheltered dozens of students who wanted to resist the tyranny of Voldemort's followers. The atmosphere was dangerous, the punishments severe, but Neville's charisma was not the loud, commanding type. Instead, it was quiet and rooted in honesty. People followed him not because he demanded it, but because he embodied the very spirit of defiance. Even Seamus Finnegan, who had once doubted Harry and distanced himself, became one of Neville's closest allies in this period. Neville's gift was working again, transforming skeptics into friends. One of the most striking examples of Neville's strength in friendship comes during the Battle of Hogwarts itself. When Harry seemingly lay dead in Hagrid's arms, Voldemort declared the fight over. Many fell silent, some even believed it was truly the end. Yet Neville, standing alone, dared to step forward. Voldemort mocked him, offering him a place among the Death Eaters, but Neville refused. In that moment, when nearly all hope seemed lost, it was his loyalty to his friends, his deep belief in their cause, that carried him forward. He pulled the sword of Gryffindor from the sorting hat and destroyed Nagini, one of the final Horcruxes. As Rowling describes, Neville was at the front, still standing, still defiant, with the sword of Gryffindor gleaming in his hand. That single act turned despair into renewed courage for everyone else. What is so remarkable about Neville's arc is that it was not built on sudden transformation, but on years of small connections. Each friendship mattered. His trust in Sirius gave him confidence to stand with adults. His bond with Luna taught him the value of listening when others dismissed. His loyalty to Harry's cause, even when Harry was gone, turned him into a symbol of unbroken faith. These friendships did not only support Neville, they defined him. They turned the boy who was once the subject of snickers into the leader people turned to when all else collapsed. It is worth remembering that Neville himself never believed he was extraordinary. He compared himself to Harry constantly, wondering why fate had chosen Harry as the boy who lived and not him, for prophecy had once suggested Neville might have been the chosen one. Yet what Neville did not see was that his destiny, though quieter, was no less powerful. He did not defeat Voldemort directly, but he provided the foundation for others to succeed. His friendships, his ability to unite those on the margins, created the very army that Harry needed in the end. Without Neville, the story of resistance inside Hogwarts would have been far bleaker. One particularly moving moment occurs when Aberforth Dumbledore shelters Neville after he escapes a brutal punishment by the Carrows. Aberforth, cynical and disillusioned, warns Neville against risking so much for a lost cause. Yet Neville's response is telling. He insists that Hogwarts still needs a leader, still needs hope. That belief didn't come from blind courage, but from the network of friendships he had nurtured. He knew he wasn't alone. Every time he looked around the Room of Requirement and saw dozens of faces willing to stand with him, he knew that resistance mattered. In a way, his faith in others was the source of his strength. Even those who once underestimated him were forced to recognize his role. Professor McGonagall, who had often scolded Neville for his forgetfulness, watched in pride as he took command of groups during the final battle. His grandmother, Augusta Longbottom, once critical of his weakness, finally saw in him the bravery of his parents, Frank and Alice Longbottom. This recognition was not because he had suddenly become perfect, but but because his friendships had amplified his courage. He had found his place not by standing alone, but by uniting with others. Neville's story is a reminder that power is not always about grand gestures or solitary heroism. It is often about the ability to bring people together, to forge connections where none seem possible. His friends were not chosen for status or influence. They were chosen because he saw their worth. Luna with her eccentricity, Seamus with his doubts, Ginny with her fiery spirit. Even students from younger years found in Neville someone who believed in them. Each friendship was a thread, and together they wove the tapestry of resistance that would one day topple Voldemort's grip on Hogwarts. The boy who once stumbled over his spells, who lost his toad, who blushed under ridicule, grew into a man who could stand alone before the Dark Lord and not tremble. And the secret of that transformation was simple. He had always believed in people, and in turn, people believed in him. Neville's gift of finding friends in unexpected places was not a footnote in the saga of Harry Potter. It was one of its quiet miracles, proving that even in the darkest times, unity and loyalty can light the way. Number 22, his heroism inspired the next generation of students. Under the shadow of Hogwarts' ruined walls, as the dust of the final battle began to settle, few names resonated as powerfully among the survivors as that of Neville Longbottom. He had not been the boy who lived, nor the chosen one, nor even the celebrated prodigy like Hermione Granger. Yet on that night when Voldemort believed victory was his, it was Neville who rose from the rubble, wounded and trembling but unbroken, and drew the sword of Gryffindor to strike down Nagini. That single act shattered the Dark Lord's illusion of immortality. For students who had hidden in fear during the war, Neville's courage became something of a legend. "It takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies," Dumbledore once told him in the first year. No one realized then how prophetic those words would become. When Neville later accepted the post of herbology professor at Hogwarts, the role was not simply a career choice, it was a continuation of his journey from timidity to triumph. Many younger students who had only heard fragments of stories about the war saw him as living proof that one did not need to be born extraordinary to become heroic. They would whisper his name when walking through the corridors, recalling the sight of him standing bloodied but proud, clutching the sword after Nagini's death. For those who doubted their own strength, Neville was a mirror, showing them that fear could coexist with courage and still lead to victory. Students such as Hannah Abbott, who later joined him as a fellow teacher, often reminded the children that Neville's transformation had not been sudden. She described how, during the formation of Dumbledore's army, Neville was often the last to master a spell, but he never gave up. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, it is noted that Neville's face was shining with excitement as he demonstrated a disarming charm. It was not mastery that made him remarkable, but persistence. Years later, when his pupils struggled in greenhouses full of prickly plants and stubborn vines, Neville would tell them that progress often came slowly, and the most determined roots were the hardest to pull. Those words carried weight because they came from someone who had once stumbled in every duel but still learned to fight. For the first generation of post-war students, the idea of the hero nobody expected became a symbol of hope. Students from Muggle families, who often felt overshadowed by peers born into magical traditions, found encouragement in Neville's story. They would recall that he had once been mocked by Draco Malfoy for failing to ride a broom, or that his grandmother worried openly about his magical ability. The legend of Neville Longbottom made its way into school traditions. In the Gryffindor common room, tales of his bravery were retold on stormy nights by the fire. Younger lions would listen in awe as older students repeated the moment he raised the sword, and some even carved his initials alongside others on the wooden tables as if to mark the permanence of his role in their shared history. What made Neville's heroism especially powerful was that it lacked the aura of destiny. Harry Potter had been chosen by prophecy, his path intertwined with Voldemort from birth. Hermione's brilliance had been evident from her first days at Hogwarts, and Ron carried the legacy of a long, wizarding family. Neville, however, seemed ordinary, even clumsy. This ordinariness is precisely what turned his eventual courage into something accessible. The fact that he had once lost his toad, Trevor, in the first year, or that he had been so nervous during potions that he melted cauldrons, made him human in the eyes of the students. When he became the professor who smiled warmly as he guided them through magical soil, his legend felt attainable rather than distant. In his teaching, Neville drew directly from the hardships he had endured. He reminded students that herbology was not just about plants, but about patience, persistence, and resilience. When describing the Mimbulus Mimbletonia, the strange cactus that had once sprayed stinksap over Harry and his friends, he spoke with a twinkle in his eye of how misunderstood plants were often the strongest survivors. Those listening understood the hidden message. Like Neville himself, even what seemed odd or weak at first could prove essential in moments of crisis. Over time, many students credited Neville not only for their love of herbology, but also for their belief in their own ability to endure. Setbacks. The legend of Neville reached beyond Gryffindor. In Hufflepuff, his story resonated with those who valued loyalty and quiet strength. Even among Slytherins, though some whispered disdainfully about his lack of ambition, others secretly admired his resolve. For Ravenclaws, his journey embodied the triumph of learning through failure, the patient accumulation of skill and confidence. Thus, Neville's name became cross-house inspiration, a rarity in the often divided culture of Hogwarts. His classes were filled with eager faces, not only because of the subject, but because he stood before them as proof of transformation. The symbolic moment often cited by those who studied at Hogwarts after the war was the Nagini lesson. Once every year, Neville would recount the Battle of Hogwarts to new students, not in the style of a boast, but as a teaching tool. He described how Voldemort's army had flooded the castle, how despair had spread among the defenders, and how in the end it was not prophecy but determination that gave him the strength to act. He would show them the sword of Gryffindor, gleaming and ancient, and remind them that courage is not being fearless, but standing even when fear is strongest. Many pupils left that lesson with the memory etched deeply into their hearts, telling one another afterward that it was the most important class they would ever attend. His influence reached further still into the world beyond Hogwarts. When the next generation of aurors and healers entered their professions, many cited Neville's example as a spark. His story appeared in textbooks not as a tale of strategy or spellcraft, but as a moral of growth. Even years after the Battle of Hogwarts, wizarding families would tell their children, if Neville could do it, so can you. In that sense, his legacy rivaled Harry's, though in a quieter and more personal way. Where Harry embodied sacrifice and destiny, Neville embodied persistence and transformation. Interestingly, Neville's grandmother, Augusta Longbottom, who once doubted her grandson's magical ability, became one of his most fervent supporters after the war. Her pride was so visible that she would attend every Hogwarts event where Neville spoke, dressed in her towering hat, and declare to anyone who would listen that her boy had saved them all. Students often found her presence amusing, but also endearing, for it reminded them that even the fiercest critic could become a believer. Neville himself often chuckled about it, using her change of heart as a reminder that perceptions can be overturned by courage and perseverance. The myth of Neville grew even larger when coupled with his friendships. His bond with Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny Weasley made students see him not as an isolated hero, but as part of the chain of resistance. When Luna Lovegood visited Hogwarts as a guest lecturer, she would recount the nights in the Room of Requirement when Neville led frightened students, fed them, and refused to bow under the Carrow's cruelty. Luna described him as the heartbeat of rebellion. Her words carried weight, for they painted Neville not only as the boy who killed Nagini, but as the steady soul who gave others hope to keep resisting even when no victory seemed possible. One of the most touching examples of his influence came during a greenhouse lesson when a nervous first year accidentally spilled a tray of mandrake seedlings. Expecting scolding, the child trembled in fear. Instead, Neville knelt beside them, gently helping replant the seedlings, and said softly that he too had once been terrified of failing. "I dropped things, I burned things, and I thought I would never belong," he admitted. The students listened intently, realizing that their professor was not simply recounting facts, but opening his own story as a lifeline to theirs. That moment spread through the school like wildfire, reinforcing his reputation not only as a hero, but as a mentor who truly understood fear. Neville's significance also lies in how his heroism was remembered by his peers. Hermione Granger, who later became Minister for Magic, often cited him in her speeches about equality and resilience. She would remind the public that Neville had not been born with accolades, but had earned them through quiet determination. Harry himself, when asked about Neville during interviews, once remarked that without Neville, the war would not have been won. These acknowledgements elevated him in the eyes of students even more, for if the boy who lived recognized Neville's part as indispensable, then surely his role was not just a footnote, but a cornerstone. Even decades later, when new generations filled the castle halls, portraits of Neville hung in the herbology greenhouses, painted not in the grandeur of armor or swords, but surrounded by lush plants, his hands stained with soil, a warm smile on his face. That image captured the duality of his legacy, the warrior who had slain a piece of darkness and the teacher who nurtured life. For students who passed by, the portrait whispered a reminder that greatness does not always roar. Sometimes it grows quietly, like roots beneath the earth, until the moment comes to break through the stone. The ripple effect of Neville's heroism ultimately created a culture at Hogwarts, where even the shyest child believed they could matter. He transformed the meaning of courage from a lofty ideal into something tangible, something students could reach for daily. Neville Longbottom's name endured not because of a prophecy or a title, but because he embodied the truth that heroism is not a birthright but a choice. His journey from a boy who quivered before Snape to the man who struck the final blow against Voldemort became the guiding legend of Hogwarts long after the fires of war had been extinguished. Number 23, his first pet was a toad named Trevor. Neville Longbottom's first companion at Hogwarts was not a cat like Hermione's Crookshanks, nor an owl like Harry's Hedwig, nor even a rat like Ron's Scabbers. Instead, he was given a rather plain and unassuming creature, a toad named Trevor. To many readers, Trevor seemed almost like a running gag throughout the early books. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Neville is described as constantly misplacing him, with the hapless amphibian slipping away at the most inconvenient times. The very first journey aboard the Hogwarts Express introduced this motif. Neville's gran had given him a toad called Trevor, who kept getting away. This was not merely an amusing anecdote. It symbolized something deeper about Neville himself, a boy who at that moment was timid, insecure, and often overlooked, just like his toad. Trevor's tendency to vanish became one of the earliest comic relief elements connected to Neville. In the sorting hat scene, even before Neville takes his place among the Gryffindors, his presence is marked by a frantic search for his missing toad. The reader sees Hermione helping him look for Trevor, already framing Neville as the awkward boy in need of assistance. This minor detail builds a first impression. Neville is not the confident hero type, but rather the child who cannot even keep track of his pet. Yet within this simple image lies a narrative device. Trevor functions as a mirror of Neville's internal struggles, embodying his sense of instability, his fear of not belonging, and his uncertainty about whether he has any magical worth. What makes Trevor even more significant is the origin of the gift itself. Readers learn through passing references that the toad was not just a random pet. He had been given to Neville by his great-uncle Algy, a family member notorious for testing Neville's magical abilities in harsh ways. In one memorable recollection, Neville tells Harry and his friends how Uncle Algy once dangled him out of a window to see if magic would manifest as he fell. When Neville survived by bouncing down the garden path, his relatives rejoiced, convinced at last that he was indeed a wizard. Trevor was a continuation of this pattern. The toad was presented not as a symbol of affection, but almost as a tool of confirmation, a pet to reinforce Neville's place in the magical world after years of doubt. This background enriches Trevor's role, making him far more than a forgettable amphibian. It is striking that J.K. Rowling chose a toad rather than a more glamorous or useful magical creature. Toads in folklore are often associated with awkwardness, plainness, and even ridicule. They do not soar majestically through the skies, nor do they speak with wit or intelligence. A toad is earthbound, sluggish, easily overlooked. In giving Neville Trevor, Rowling quietly highlighted the way others saw him at the start, clumsy, anxious, weighed down by expectations he could not seem to meet. The fact that Trevor kept slipping away almost mocked Neville's inability to hold on to confidence. Each disappearance whispered to readers that Neville himself was slipping through the cracks of his own identity, unsure where he belonged. One of the most memorable early moments involving Trevor occurs during the first flying lesson in Philosopher's Stone. While Harry is learning the exhilaration of broomstick flight and Malfoy is showing off his arrogance, Neville's nervousness gets the better of him. He loses control, crashes, and is carried away to the hospital wing. Later, the focus shifts, but Trevor's presence had already reinforced Neville's position as the comic outsider. When Trevor hops out of sight or is handed back to Neville by a classmate, the reader instinctively smiles at the boy's misfortune, but beneath the smile lies empathy for a child who cannot yet grasp his own worth. It is also telling that Trevor rarely contributes to any grand plot point. He does not deliver letters, nor does he reveal secrets, nor does he play the heroic role that other pets sometimes do in the series. Instead, he serves as a narrative echo, always reminding readers of Neville's perceived weakness. In Prisoner of Azkaban, when Professor Lupin demonstrates the ridiculous spell, Neville's boggart takes the form of Severus Snape. With a flash of creativity, Neville imagines Snape dressed in his grandmother's clothes, turning terror into laughter. The moment is triumphant for Neville, yet the shadow of Trevor lingers. Readers recall that this is the same boy who could not keep his toad in check, now slowly learning to master his fears. The deeper symbolism becomes more apparent as the series progresses. As Neville begins to grow into his role as a true Gryffindor, Trevor's appearances dwindle. By Goblet of Fire, and especially Order of the Phoenix, the once frequent motif of the missing toad almost vanishes. This silence is no accident. It subtly marks Neville's evolution. The boy who once needed a toad to define his awkwardness no longer required that crutch in the story. His courage, though slow to surface, begins to shine through. He joins Dumbledore's army, practices defensive spells, and shows loyalty that rivals Harry's. The absence of Trevor in these later scenes reads like a quiet farewell to childhood clumsiness. One might argue that Trevor, by vanishing from the spotlight, symbolizes Neville's shedding of the doubts that once plagued him. Early on, Neville clutched at Trevor as though the toad's presence affirmed his place at Hogwarts. But as Neville's self-worth grew, he no longer needed the toad to represent his belonging. Instead, he earned that belonging through his own choices, standing up to friends when he believed they were wrong, fighting Death Eaters in the Ministry, and eventually rising as a leader during Harry's absence in the final book. Trevor's silence becomes the measure of Neville's growth. When readers no longer notice the toad, it is because they are finally noticing Neville. In Order of the Phoenix, there is a quiet moment when Harry, Ron, and Hermione visit Neville in St. Mungo's Hospital and learn the truth about his parents, Alice and Frank Longbottom. Here, Trevor is not mentioned at all. The scene is solemn, heavy with grief, yet it redefines Neville in the eyes of his friends and the reader. No longer just the boy with the runaway toad, Neville is revealed as the child of tortured heroes, burdened with a legacy of pain and resilience. The omission of Trevor in such a pivotal moment is symbolic. Neville's identity is no longer framed by a comic pet, but by the profound reality of his lineage and courage. By the time of Half-Blood Prince, Neville is still nervous, still prone to mishaps, but he has matured into a loyal fighter. During the Battle of the Astronomy Tower, he joins the struggle against the Death Eaters. Once again, Trevor is absent. The boy and the toad have parted ways in the narrative, as though the story itself acknowledges that Neville has outgrown that symbol of his clumsiness. Instead, readers now see him wielding his wand with determination, refusing to shrink away from the dangers around him. Trevor, once the comic anchor, has served his purpose and is no longer needed. The culmination of this evolution arrives in Deathly Hallows. With Harry, Ron and Hermione away, Neville emerges as one of the leaders of the resistance at Hogwarts. He organizes Dumbledore's army in secret, defies the Carrows, and even turns the Room of Requirement into a sanctuary for students. The boy who once lost his toad now guides others, displaying courage that astonishes even his peers. In the climactic Battle of Hogwarts, Neville draws the sword of Gryffindor from the Sorting Hat and strikes down Nagini, the final Horcrux. The narrative that began with a frightened boy chasing after a runaway toad ends with that same boy delivering one of the most decisive blows in the war against Voldemort. This progression illustrates how Trevor was never meant to be a lasting companion, but rather a narrative device. He was the physical representation of Neville's early insecurity, a creature that slipped away because Neville's confidence slipped away. As Neville grew, Trevor faded, allowing the young wizard to stand on his own. The fact that Rowling does not kill Trevor off or give him a dramatic farewell is also significant. Trevor simply disappears into the background, just as Neville's self-doubt quietly dissolved over time. The absence is the message. Neville's relationship with Trevor also invites reflection on how Rowling constructs symbols in seemingly trivial details. To a casual reader, Trevor is nothing more than comic relief, but attentive readers recognize the layers: the toad as a gift from a demanding uncle, the toad as a reminder of inadequacy, the toad as a disappearing act that mirrors Neville's fading timidity. This depth is what transforms a children's story into a mythic saga. Trevor teaches us that even the smallest, most overlooked elements can hold meaning in the arc of character development. It is fascinating to compare Trevor's role with the pets of other main characters. Hedwig, Harry's owl, is graceful, loyal, and ultimately sacrifices her life in battle, a symbol of Harry's journey from innocence to responsibility. Crookshanks, Hermione's cat, is clever and perceptive, a mirror of her intellect and suspicion. Scabbers, Ron's rat, turns out to be a traitor in disguise, symbolizing the hidden dangers in trusting appearances. Trevor, unlike them, is not heroic, not clever, not treacherous. He is forgetful, plain, and ordinary, exactly as Neville was first perceived. Yet his quiet disappearance is more profound than any grand gesture, marking one of the most satisfying arcs in the series. The next time readers recall Neville chasing after Trevor in the corridors of Hogwarts, they can see more than a joke. They can see the fragile beginnings of a character who would one day rise to heroic heights. They can understand why Rowling allowed that toad to slip into the shadows as Neville stepped into the light. Trevor, in his own modest way, is part of the tapestry of Neville's transformation, a creature that embodied his uncertainty until he no longer needed it. And though the books stop mentioning him, Trevor remains etched in memory, a reminder that even the humblest details can symbolize the profound journey of growing up. Number 24, the only one to stand up to his friends in first year. Neville Longbottom's story in the Harry Potter series has often been described as one of growth, quiet resilience, and eventual triumph. Yet, even in the very first book, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, J.K. Rowling planted a moment that foreshadowed his future role as a true Gryffindor. In one of the most overlooked but significant scenes, Neville does something extraordinary. He decides to stand in the way of his own friends. This moment happens when Harry Potter, Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger are sneaking out late at night, determined to head toward the forbidden third-floor corridor. The entire weight of Neville's usually timid personality seems to collapse under the pressure of doing what is right, and he ends up blocking their path in the Gryffindor common room. It is here that we see Neville's first true act of bravery, one that Dumbledore later recognizes as even greater than battling an obvious enemy. To understand the significance of Neville's act, it is essential to remember the context. Throughout his first year, Neville is portrayed as clumsy, forgetful, and easily frightened. He struggles with spells in Professor Flitwick's charms class, fails to keep control of his broom during flying lessons, and often finds himself a target of Draco Malfoy's cruel jokes. Even his friends sometimes dismiss him as someone who lacks courage or ability. Harry and Ron frequently step into trouble with a mix of recklessness and curiosity, while Hermione balances her intelligence with rule-following tendencies that occasionally bend under pressure. Neville, on the other hand, appears trapped between his own fears and a desire to live up to the reputation of his Gryffindor house. So when he chooses to oppose his friends on that fateful night, it carries immense weight precisely because it comes from someone who has struggled to find his place. The actual moment is described with striking clarity in the book. Rowling writes, "Neville, you don't understand," said Harry, trying to push past him. But Neville stood in front of the portrait hole, blocking their way. "You can't go out, you'll get into trouble, you'll lose Gryffindor more points, I won't let you do it." Those lines capture Neville's desperation to protect not just his friends, but also the honor of his house. The irony is that while Harry, Ron, and Hermione believe they are acting bravely by pursuing a dangerous mission, Neville recognizes the very real consequences their actions could bring. He is not afraid of physical harm at this moment. Rather, he is afraid of the shame that will come upon Gryffindor if they lose more points and potentially lose the House Cup. For Neville, who rarely shines, the House Cup represents something collective, something that ties him to a sense of belonging. It is important to note that Neville's courage here is not glamorous. He is not brandishing a wand, nor is he casting any impressive spell. Instead, his bravery is rooted in his stubborn insistence that his friends should not jeopardize themselves and their house. This is a different kind of courage, one that does not involve duels or battles, but moral strength. His legs may be shaking, his voice uncertain, yet he chooses to act. Many readers overlook this moment because the larger plot quickly moves on toward the climax with the Philosopher's Stone, but Dumbledore does not forget it. In fact, this act becomes the reason Neville is singled out during the end-of-year feast. At the Great Hall, after Slytherin has seemingly won the House Cup, Dumbledore begins awarding last-minute points. He gives points to Harry, Ron, and Hermione for their bravery and intelligence during the quest for the stone. But then, with his signature dramatic pause, Dumbledore announces, "There are all kinds of courage. It takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies, but just as much to stand up to our friends. I therefore award 10 points to Mr. Neville Longbottom." The hall erupts into cheers, and that small addition of 10 points tips the scales in Gryffindor's favor, making them the winners of the House Cup. This public recognition of Neville's courage is not simply a reward, but a powerful message about what bravery truly means. This scene also reshapes the way readers should see Neville. Up until then, he is easy to dismiss as comic relief. His constant misfortunes and bumbling nature overshadow his potential. Yet Dumbledore's words elevate Neville, positioning him as a figure of quiet moral integrity. The idea that standing up to friends could be harder than confronting enemies is something deeply human. Enemies are expected to oppose you, but when you challenge those you care about, you risk rejection, isolation, and ridicule. For Neville, who has struggled all year to find acceptance, this risk is monumental. Yet he takes it, showing that his sense of right and wrong is stronger than his desire to be liked. From a narrative perspective, this moment foreshadows Neville's later development. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, he becomes one of the key members of Dumbledore's army, training alongside Harry and the others to resist Umbridge's oppressive rule. He fights bravely at the Department of Mysteries, holding his own against Death Eaters despite injuries. And ultimately, in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Neville leads the resistance at Hogwarts, destroying Voldemort's final Horcrux when he slays Nagini with the Sword of Gryffindor. The seed of that final act can be traced back to his first year, when he refused to let his friends act recklessly. It is the same moral compass, the same willingness to act despite fear, that guides him throughout the series. Neville's stand against Harry, Ron, and Hermione also underscores one of the central themes of the books, that courage is not one-dimensional. Gryffindor values bravery, but bravery manifests in many forms. Harry's courage is often loud and dramatic, seen in his battles with Quirrell, the Basilisk, or Voldemort. Hermione's bravery is intellectual, grounded in preparation and problem-solving under pressure. Ron's courage frequently arises from loyalty and a willingness to follow his friends into danger despite his fears. Neville's, however, is different. It is moral courage, the ability to say no when everyone else says yes. Dumbledore's recognition of this difference enriches the concept of bravery for readers. Another striking aspect of this moment is its effect on Gryffindor's victory. Without Neville's 10 points, Slytherin would have retained the House Cup. This adds a symbolic layer. Neville's small but crucial act becomes the decisive factor in Gryffindor's triumph. It is almost poetic justice that the boy who spent the entire year as a source of ridicule and pity ends up holding the balance of victory. In this sense, Rowling cleverly uses Neville's action to remind readers that greatness can come from unexpected places and that the contributions of the overlooked can change outcomes. There is also an emotional depth to Neville's decision that resonates beyond the book. For young readers especially, the idea that standing up to peers could be as brave as fighting villains is a powerful lesson. Peer pressure is often more daunting than open conflict, and Rowling captures that reality through Neville's choice. His shaking legs and uncertain words reflect the vulnerability that many children feel when resisting their friends, yet his persistence provides an aspirational model. This is part of why Dumbledore's words continue to be quoted widely. They offer wisdom that extends beyond the magical world. Critically, Neville's action also highlights his integrity. He is not motivated by personal gain, glory, or recognition. Unlike Harry, Ron, and Hermione, who seek to protect the stone and face Voldemort, Neville's goal is simply to keep his friends safe and his house from disgrace. It is a small, unglamorous motivation, but it is authentic. Integrity often means making decisions that no one else will applaud, and Neville embodies that truth. The fact that Dumbledore chooses to honor it shows how deeply the headmaster values honesty and moral courage. Looking at the series as a whole, this moment also reflects Rowling's skill in layering her characters. Neville could have remained a side character, a clumsy foil to the main trio. Instead, she seeds early evidence of his bravery and values, ensuring that when he eventually steps into the role of hero, it feels earned rather than sudden. Readers who remember this scene see his later triumphs as a continuation of a long journey, rather than an unexpected twist. In storytelling terms, this is careful character building that rewards attentive reading. One might also reflect on how Harry responds to Neville in later years. During the Battle of Hogwarts, Harry entrusts Neville with the mission of killing Nagini if something happens to him. This trust is not arbitrary. It is built on years of shared experience and recognition of Neville's courage. The roots of that trust can again be traced to their first year, when Neville showed that he was willing to act according to principle, even when it meant opposing Harry himself. The arc comes full circle, when Neville, once underestimated, becomes a symbol of resistance and leadership. Finally, this moment remains significant because it shows that courage is accessible to everyone, not just the chosen ones. Harry may be the boy who lived, destined for greatness, but Neville shows that ordinary choices made by ordinary people can be just as heroic. For readers who may not see themselves as the protagonist in their own lives, Neville's example offers comfort. His act in the common room reminds us that bravery does not always mean saving the world. Sometimes it means standing up, trembling but resolute, for what you believe is right. Number 25. He inherited his father's aura qualities. Neville Longbottom's destiny was never straightforward, and that is precisely why his story holds such weight in the wizarding world. When readers first met him in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, he was the nervous boy who lost his toad, Trevor, and who stumbled more often than he walked with confidence. Yet hidden beneath that timid exterior was an unshakable core of bravery, a legacy not only of the bloodline of pure-blood Longbottoms, but also of his father, Frank Longbottom, once one of the most respected auras in the Ministry of Magic. Few remember that Frank, alongside his wife Alice, stood shoulder to shoulder with Alastair Moody and other giants of the Order of the Phoenix. That lineage carried expectations, and though Neville chose the path of herbology, one can see in retrospect that he carried within him the very talent for aura work that made his father legendary. When Frank Longbottom fought Death Eaters during the First Wizarding War, he developed a reputation for persistence and courage that even Voldemort's inner circle found difficult to overcome. His eventual capture and torture at the hands of Bellatrix Lestrange was not a sign of weakness, but rather of the unrelenting ferocity with which the Death Eaters sought to break him. Neville inherited that determination, though it did not emerge in him overnight. The boy who trembled before Professor Snape and failed to master charms in his early years at Hogwarts was the same boy who, when the moment demanded it, stood unflinching with the sword of Gryffindor in his hand. The seeds of aura potential were always within him. They simply waited for the right soil and season to grow. Consider the events of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. It was Neville, alongside Harry, Hermione, Luna, Ginny, and Ron, who charged into the Department of Mysteries, facing a cadre of Death Eaters without hesitation. At that time, he was still recovering from his grandmother Augusta's constant reminders that he was not living up to the Longbottom name, yet in that battle he revealed something his classmates had rarely witnessed: relentless tenacity. Even after his nose was broken and his wand hand injured, Neville refused to leave Harry's side. He stammered, bloodied, but still told, "Harry, I'll join you." That moment is more than loyalty. It is the essence of an aura, someone who keeps fighting no matter the personal cost. Auras are not defined solely by raw magical skill, but by courage under duress, and Neville proved again and again that he possessed this rare quality. In the Battle of Hogwarts, he was not a secondary figure lingering in the shadows. He became one of the central figures in the Resistance. The Gryffindor Common Room was transformed into a sanctuary for Dumbledore's army under his leadership. As Harry, Ron, and Hermione searched for Horcruxes, Neville stayed behind and bore the full brunt of the Carrow's cruelty. He endured beatings, starvation, and humiliation, but he organized rebellion, encouraged others to resist, and never abandoned the fight. When his grandmother was attacked at home, he did not waver. Instead, he disappeared into the shadows, evading capture and reappearing when his comrades needed him most. These are not merely the actions of a student, they are the hallmarks of a field aura who thrives on resistance against overwhelming odds. One of the most vivid examples of Neville's latent aura talent comes at the climax of the Battle of Hogwarts. Voldemort believed he had broken the Defender's spirit when he called Neville forward and demanded allegiance. Yet Neville, with the sorting hat forced onto his head and the heat of fire burning his skin, drew the sword of Gryffindor and destroyed Nagini, the final Horcrux. That single act shattered Voldemort's protection and paved the way for Harry's ultimate victory. It was a feat of courage so profound that even Voldemort himself underestimated him until the very last moment. Neville did not hesitate, and in that decisive strike he demonstrated every quality an Auror requires: bravery, precision, and absolute commitment to a cause greater than himself. What makes Neville's story remarkable is not only that he had the talent for Auror work, but that he chose not to pursue it. After the war, he did not follow in the footsteps of his father, despite having proven himself capable. Instead, he turned toward herbology and became a professor at Hogwarts. This decision underscores a truth often overlooked in discussions about Neville. He did not crave the glory of hunting dark wizards, even though he could have excelled. His soul leaned toward healing, teaching, and cultivating life rather than extinguishing it. Yet, paradoxically, this choice makes him even more like an Auror. For Aurors fight to protect peace, and Neville dedicated the rest of his life to nurturing that peace in the next generation. The inheritance of his father's courage is underscored by the words of Professor McGonagall, who once told him that his bravery in standing up to his friends in Philosopher's Stone was worth more than points could measure. "It takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies," she said, "but just as much to stand up to our friends." From the very beginning, Neville showed that courage was not foreign to him. It simply expressed itself differently until the war demanded he become the warrior his lineage foretold fans. Often remark that had fate placed Neville in Harry's position, the prophecy could have been fulfilled through him. Indeed, Voldemort himself chose Harry not because Neville lacked potential, but because he feared the qualities in Harry that mirrored his own. Still, the possibility remains that Neville could have risen to the same challenge. The fan community often revisits the image of Neville wielding the sword of Gryffindor as symbolic of his parallel path. While Harry embodied the role of the Chosen One, Neville embodied the role of the Unchosen One, who nonetheless chose bravery. Auror training requires resilience, spellwork, proficiency, and the ability to act under pressure. Though Neville struggled academically, his growth illustrates that such qualities are not innate gifts, but can be honed through determination. He may have faltered in charms class, but he excelled when lives were at stake, which is precisely the crucible in which Aurors are formed. Frank Longbottom's shadow was long, but Neville did not live in it. He extended it. When he stood before Voldemort, wandless and battered, he showed the same refusal to bow that defined his parents. Bellatrix Lestrange, who had broken Frank and Alice's minds, once mocked Neville in the Department of Mysteries, telling him he was weak like his father. Yet in the end, it was Neville who outlasted her and survived the war she could not. His triumph over her and the Death Eaters was not a matter of revenge, but of legacy fulfilled. That legacy carried the spirit of an Auror, even if Neville's profession carried the name of professor. Herbology, however, was not an escape from battle, but an extension of it. Plants like the Mimbolus Mimbletonia or the venomous Tentacula were as much weapons in the right hands as wands. Neville saw the connection between nurturing magical plants and defending against the dark arts. His classroom was no less a battlefield, for it became the place where young witches and wizards learned to respect the balance between life and destruction. In this way, Neville extended his father's mission in a quieter, more enduring form. Instead of chasing dark wizards, he raised a generation capable of standing against them. The importance of choice in Neville's arc cannot be overstated. He could have become an Auror, trained at the Ministry, and followed Frank's path step by step. Many fans argue he would have thrived, and indeed Kingsley Shacklebolt himself would likely have welcomed Neville into the Auror office after the war. But Neville's decision to teach shows a conscious refusal to let violence dictate his life's trajectory. After years of suffering under Voldemort's shadow, Neville chose to cultivate instead of destroy, to nurture instead of hunt. This makes his bravery even purer, for he did not need the title of Auror to prove his worth. Neville's story also challenges the common perception of what heroism looks like. It is easy to revere Harry, the boy who bore the scar and the prophecy, but Neville represents the ordinary wizard who rises to extraordinary circumstances. His heroism lies not in prophecy but in choice. Every time he stood up to the Carrows, every time he sheltered a younger student, every time he swung the sword of Gryffindor, he proved himself as much an Auror in spirit as any who carried the badge of the ministry. When future Hogwarts students walk the corridors and hear the tales of the Battle of Hogwarts, they may see Neville's portrait and know him as a professor of herbology. But those who look closer will see the warrior beneath the robes, the Auror by blood and by deed, even if not by title. His calm presence in the greenhouse belied the lion's heart that roared on the battlefield. That balance of warrior and scholar makes him one of the most compelling figures in the saga, for he demonstrates that a hero's path is not singular but varied, shaped as much by inheritance as by personal conviction. It is no surprise, then, that Neville Longbottom remains one of the most beloved characters among fans. His humility, his struggle, and his eventual triumph reflect the very essence of courage in the wizarding world. While he never applied for the Auror office, readers see in him the embodiment of everything an Auror should be. He was his father's son, even if his legacy was lived out in the soil of the greenhouses rather than the dark alleys of wizarding duels. That truth is what makes Neville unforgettable, the quiet boy who could have been an Auror but instead became something rarer, a man who chose peace when he had every right to choose war. Number 26, a lifelong friend of the Potter and Weasley families. Of all the characters who grew from the shadows of Hogwarts into the light of true heroism, Neville Longbottom remains one of the most underestimated. Yet after the Battle of Hogwarts, his story did not fade into the background, nor did his relationships with the Golden Trio. Instead, his bond with Harry Potter, Ginny Weasley, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger became one of the strongest friendships of their adult lives. The boy who once trembled when Professor Snape entered the classroom eventually stood shoulder to shoulder with Harry against Voldemort, and from that night forward, Neville was never again seen as the awkward student fumbling with his wand. He was a friend, a confidant, and eventually a mentor to the next generation of Potters and Weasleys, a living reminder that courage and loyalty can create lifelong family ties. The moment Neville drew the sword of Gryffindor and struck down Nagini, Voldemort's last Horcrux, is etched into the legacy of Hogwarts. But what happened afterward is perhaps less known. Harry, who had seen firsthand how much Neville had grown, never treated him as anything less than an equal. The war had cemented their bond. It is written in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Neville had come back, brandishing the sword of Gryffindor, and the hat had provided it at his moment of need. That moment wasn't just a battlefield triumph, it was a turning point in Neville's destiny. Harry recognized it, and so did Ginny, Ron, and Hermione. In the years after Voldemort's fall, Neville became not just their friend, but a member of their extended family, someone they trusted with their children, their secrets, and their daily lives. Neville's visits to Harry and Ginny's home became a cherished tradition. He would drop by for tea at Shell Cottage when the Potters stayed there, or later at their home in London, where James Sirius, Albus Severus, and Lily Luna grew up calling him Uncle Neville. Ginny, who knew better than anyone how much Neville's bravery mattered on the battlefield, once told her children about the night he stood in front of Voldemort and refused to surrender. "It will not end here," Neville had shouted that night, echoing the very same defiance Harry carried in his heart. For the children, this was not just a heroic tale, it was a story told by the man himself, sitting in their living room sipping tea with a warmth that only a true family friend could bring. The Weasleys also held Neville close. Ron and Hermione, raising Rose and Hugo, often invited Neville to the Burrow, where Molly Weasley fussed over him as though he were her own. For Molly, who had lost Fred in the war, seeing Neville laugh with her children brought comfort. Neville, in turn, brought his quiet loyalty to their gatherings. He would join in the raucous Weasley dinners, sometimes sitting beside George, who found in him a steady, grounding presence after the loss of his twin. In these moments, Neville was not the nervous boy with a forgetful nature, but a pillar of strength, part of the foundation of the family that had carried Harry through so much. Neville's bond with Hermione was also profound. Though their personalities differed, Hermione's sharp intellect, sometimes clashing with Neville's gentleness, their respect for one another ran deep. After the war, Hermione often praised Neville's knowledge of herbology. He, in turn, credited her insistence on study habits during their school years for giving him the perseverance he needed to become a professor. When Rose Granger Weasley entered Hogwarts, Neville became not only her teacher but also her parents' trusted ally within the castle walls. To Rose, he was more than a professor. He was a family friend who had been part of her life since she was a child.